May 1945. The Netherlands. Liberation parades flood the streets. Dutch children wave at passing soldiers. Newsreel cameras roll. Radio broadcasts crackle across the Atlantic. Allied forces free Holland. Montgomery's 21st Army Group completes liberation. British and American troops push into the heart of Europe. The world hears the headlines. The names that echo loudest are Eisenhower, Montgomery, Patton. But on the cobblestones of Apeldoorn and Groningen, on the dikes of Walcheren and the frozen roads outside Arnhem, the boots that marched were not British. They were not American. They were Canadian. Over 1 million Canadians served in the Second World War. Their blood soaked the beaches of Normandy, the mud of the Scheldt, the rubble of Ortona. They carried some of the most grueling campaigns of the Western Front. Yet somehow, in the decades that followed, the world forgot whose hands turned the tide. This is the story of how it happened, and why it was allowed to fade. To understand how Canada's war contribution faded from public memory, you must first understand who held the microphone. The Second World War was not only fought with tanks and artillery, it was fought with headlines, with radio frequencies, with film reels approved in London and printed in New York. And from the very beginning, the machinery of that information war was controlled by two powers, Britain and the United States. The Allied command structure made this almost inevitable. Canadian forces overseas fell under British operational command for most of the war. The 1st Canadian Army, though led by Canadians, served within Montgomery's 21st Army Group. Orders flowed from London. Communiques followed the same route. When victories were announced, they carried British framing. Regiments were named. Armies were referenced. But specificity often stopped at the national level. Unless you were British or American, the Canadians became Allied forces, or simply Montgomery's men. This was not always deliberate erasure. It was structural. The communications infrastructure of the Allied war effort ran through British channels. Press releases, battle summaries, operational updates. All were compiled and distributed by British staff officers before reaching the outside world. American forces had their own extensive public affairs machinery, funded and coordinated through Washington. Their war correspondents moved with resources and access that smaller nations could not match. Canada had journalists, brave ones. Correspondents like Ross Munro, who landed on the beaches of Dieppe and Normandy, and Matthew Holton, whose CBC broadcasts carried the voice of Canadian soldiers into living rooms across the Dominion. But their reach was limited. Their footage often folded into British newsreels. Their stories competed against the enormous machinery of Fleet Street and American wire services. The asymmetry was not about truth, it was about volume. And then there was censorship. Every dispatch filed by a war correspondent, Canadian, British or American, passed through military censors before reaching the public. In the European theatre, that censorship authority rested primarily with British command. The goal was operational security. No troop movements, no unit strengths, no details that might aid the enemy. But censorship also shaped narrative. What was emphasized, what was minimized, what never made it past the editor's desk. British newsreels dominated cinema screens across the Commonwealth. Pathé, Movietone, Gaumont. These were the windows through which the world saw the war. And those windows were designed, edited and narrated in London. American studios held the other half of the frame. Hollywood produced war films even while battles still raged. The Office of War Information coordinated messaging with filmmakers, ensuring American heroism was front and center. Canada had no equivalent. No major global film industry, no dominant wire service, no broadcasting network that could rival the BBC or CBS. What Canada had was courage, sacrifice, and a constitutional position that made it nearly invisible. As a dominion within the British Commonwealth, Canada entered the war independently, but operated inside British command frameworks. Canadian generals reported to British superiors. Canadian victories were announced through British channels. This was not subjugation. It was alliance. But alliances in war are rarely remembered equally. When the histories were written in the decade after 1945, the authors who shaped public memory were overwhelmingly British and American. Chester Wilmot, Cornelius Ryan, Stephen Ambrose. These were the names that defined how the world remembered the Second World War, and in their pages, Canada appeared as a footnote. Not because the facts were hidden, but because no one with a loudspeaker chose to amplify them. The Canadians had done the fighting. Others would do the telling. The pattern emerges not from theory, but from blood. Consider what happened on the morning of June 6, 1944, Juno Beach, Normandy. The 3rd Canadian Infantry Division landed under heavy fire on a coastline bristling with fortifications. The seas were rough. The timing was late. German defenders had more time to prepare than expected. Within the first hour, casualties were staggering. The Royal Winnipeg Rifles, the Regina Rifle Regiment, the Queen's Own Rifles of Canada. These units absorbed some of the highest loss rates of any Allied force that morning. And yet, by nightfall, the Canadians had pushed further inland than any other Allied division on D-Day. They had linked up with British forces. They had cut key roads. They had done what was asked of them and more. But in the newsreels that followed, the beaches that echoed loudest were Omaha and Utah. American sacrifice, genuine and profound, became the defining image of D-Day in popular memory. Juno was mentioned, then folded into British and Canadian forces, then simplified to Montgomery's troops. The credit drifted upward, absorbed into command structures and national narratives louder than Canada's own. What followed was worse. The battle for Caen was supposed to take one day. It took over 2 months. British and Canadian forces threw themselves against entrenched German panzer divisions in some of the most brutal fighting of the Normandy campaign. The 2nd Canadian Corps bore a staggering share of that burden. Operation Atlantic, Operation Spring. These names are barely remembered outside Canada today, but they should be. On July 25, 1944, Operation Spring became one of the bloodiest single days for Canadian forces since Dieppe. The Black Watch of Canada lost nearly an entire company in a single assault. The North Nova Scotia Highlanders were shattered against fortified positions. More than 1,500 Canadians fell in a single day. And in the Allied press, the focus remained on the American breakout at Operation Cobra, happening simultaneously to the west. The Canadians were holding the hinge, fixing German armour in place, bleeding so that others could advance. But hinges don't make headlines. Montgomery's dispatches emphasized his overall command. American correspondents focused on Patton's dramatic sweep through France. The British press covered British regiments. The Canadian role, central to the entire strategic design, was acknowledged in staff reports and then quietly forgotten in public memory. The pattern was forming, and it would repeat again and again wherever Canadians fought hardest. Ortona, Italy, December 1943. 6 months before Normandy, the 1st Canadian Infantry Division was already learning what it meant to carry the weight. The Italian campaign was Britain's strategic priority, Churchill's soft underbelly of Europe. The Canadians were there from Sicily onward, fighting through mountains and mud, village by village. But it was Ortona where the cost became undeniable. The ancient town on the Adriatic coast became a fortress. German paratroopers fortified every building, every alley, every stairwell. The loyal Edmonton Regiment and the Seaforth Highlanders of Canada fought house to house, room to room. They called it mouse-holing, blasting through interior walls to avoid the kill zones of open streets. The Germans called it a miniature Stalingrad. The battle lasted 8 days. More than 2,300 Canadians were killed or wounded in the town and its approaches. The victory opened the road north, but the headlines that reached London and New York framed it within the broader 8th Army narrative, under British command. Canada had bled for a victory that the world would remember as British. The Scheldt, October to November 1944. This was the campaign that should have made Canada's contribution undeniable. After the Normandy breakout, the Allies raced across France and Belgium. By September, they had captured Antwerp, the largest port in Europe, intact. But there was a problem. Antwerp was useless without access to the sea, and the only route, the Scheldt estuary, was held by over 80,000 German troops dug into flooded polders, fortified islands and concrete bunkers. The 1st Canadian Army was given the task. For 5 brutal weeks, Canadians fought through waist-deep water under constant artillery fire against an enemy determined to hold. The Battle of the Breskin's Pocket, the assault on Walcheren Island. Names etched into regimental histories, but absent from most popular accounts of the war. By November 8th, the estuary was clear. Allied supply lines were saved. The advance into Germany could continue. The cost? Nearly 13,000 Canadian casualties. And the credit? Montgomery praised the operation. Eisenhower acknowledged its importance. But the press had already moved on, focused on Operation Market Garden, on the Rhine, on the final push. The Scheldt became a footnote. The Netherlands, April to May 1945. When liberation finally came to the Dutch people, it came wearing Canadian uniforms. The 1st Canadian Army swept through the northern provinces. Groningen, Apeldoorn, Arnhem. Town after town opened its doors to soldiers who had crossed an ocean to set them free. In the Netherlands, they have never forgotten. Every May 5th, Canadians are honoured as liberators. But in the broader Allied narrative, in films, in textbooks, in popular memory, the liberation of Western Europe remained an American and British story. The Canadians had carried the weight, and the world had looked the other way. The numbers do not lie. By the end of the Second World War, more than 45,000 Canadians had given their lives. Another 55,000 were wounded. From a nation of just 11 million people, over 1 million served in uniform. Per capita, Canada's sacrifice rivaled that of any Western Allied nation. Yet when the histories were written, when the documentaries were filmed, when the monuments were dedicated, the Canadian story shrank. Consider the contrast. At Juno Beach, Canadian casualties on D-Day exceeded those at any British beach. Only Omaha, where American forces faced a bloodbath, saw higher losses. Yet in popular memory, D-Day became an American and British story. Juno faded to a footnote. In the Scheldt, the 1st Canadian Army suffered 13,000 casualties to open Antwerp, a logistical victory that saved the entire Allied advance. The operation received a fraction of the press coverage given to Market Garden, a British-led failure. At Ortona, Canadians fought one of the most intense urban battles of the entire war. The Germans respected them enough to compare it to Stalingrad. The British press mentioned it briefly and moved on. The enemy noticed what the Allies often overlooked. German commanders recorded their assessments of opposing forces with clinical precision. In their operational reports, Canadian divisions were consistently rated as aggressive, effective, and dangerous. Generalleutnant Kurt Chill, commanding German forces during the Scheldt, later acknowledged the relentless pressure of Canadian attacks. Panzer commanders in Normandy noted the tenacity of Canadian infantry around Caen. The Wehrmacht did not confuse Canadians with British troops. They knew who was killing them. But the Allied press, controlled from London and New York, often made no such distinction. Canadian soldiers stand in a Dutch town square, surrounded by cheering civilians. Tulips are pressed into their hands. Children sit on the hoods of jeeps. The relief on every face is unmistakable. This is liberation. But when newsreel narrators voiced over similar footage, the words that reached audiences in London and New York told a simpler story. Allied forces complete the liberation of Western Europe. Allied forces. Montgomery's army. The 21st Army Group. Technically accurate, emotionally hollow. The pattern was never a conspiracy. It was something quieter and more permanent. It was infrastructure. It was habit. It was the natural gravity of power. Britain had the BBC. America had Hollywood. Canada had neither. British generals wrote memoirs that emphasized British leadership. American generals did the same. Montgomery's post-war accounts positioned him at the center of every victory. Eisenhower's narratives balanced American and British contributions with political care. Canada's generals, men like Guy Simons, one of the finest corps commanders of the war, wrote little for public audiences. Their voices did not echo in bookstores or cinemas. The men who shaped global memory were not liars. They simply told the story from where they stood, and where they stood was not Juno Beach, not the Scheldt, not the frozen rubble of Ortona. Official war histories were published. Canada produced its own, meticulous and accurate, but these volumes gathered dust in military libraries. They did not compete with the paperback narratives filling train stations and airport shelves. The result was a slow fade. Not erasure, but displacement. A world that remembered D-Day as American, the Italian campaign as British, the liberation of Europe as an Anglo-American triumph. Canada's contribution did not disappear. It was simply never given the microphone. The soldiers came home. They returned to farms in Saskatchewan, to factories in Hamilton, to fishing villages in Nova Scotia. They took off their uniforms, quietly folded their medals into drawers, and resumed lives interrupted by 6 years of war. There were no ticker-tape parades through Manhattan, no grand victory columns through London. Canada celebrated, but modestly, in its own way. And then the forgetting began. In British schools, the war was taught as a story of the Blitz, Dunkirk, El Alamein, and D-Day. Canadian contributions appeared occasionally, briefly, before the narrative moved on. In American classrooms, the arc was simpler still. Pearl Harbor, Normandy, the liberation of Paris, victory in Europe. The faces were American. The flags were American. The glory was American. Canadian textbooks told a fuller story, but even there the national narrative struggled to compete with the flood of imported films, books, and television programs that shaped how young people understood the war. Hollywood made Saving Private Ryan, The Longest Day, Band of Brothers. Canada's war films were few, underfunded, and rarely seen beyond its borders. The veterans noticed. Men who had stormed Juno, cleared the Scheldt, and liberated Holland, watched as their sacrifices were absorbed into other nations' legends. They did not complain loudly. That was not their way. But they remembered. Decades passed. The veterans aged. Their numbers thinned. And with every passing year, the living memory of what they had done faded further from public consciousness. In the Netherlands, the memory endured. Dutch families still tend Canadian graves. Every May, liberation ceremonies draw thousands. The bond between Canada and Holland remains unbroken, but elsewhere the drift continued. Ask a student in London or Los Angeles who liberated the Netherlands, and the answer is uncertain. Ask who landed at Normandy, and the response is reflexive. Americans and British. Ask about the Scheldt, and the silence is complete. This is not hostility. It is not conspiracy. It is simply what happens when stories are told by those with the loudest voices. Canada's voice was never loud. Its generals did not seek celebrity. Its government did not build cultural machines to project national glory. Its soldiers returned home and got on with living. The humility was honorable, but it had a cost. Generations grew up without knowing that Canadians had carried some of the heaviest burdens of the Western Front, without knowing that their great-grandfathers had fought through battles every bit as brutal as those celebrated in American and British cinema. The war was won. The memory was lost, and somewhere in the quiet of regimental halls and legion branches, old men with fading ribbons wondered if anyone would remember. This is not a story about grievance. The Canadians who served in the Second World War did not fight for headlines. They fought because it was necessary, because their country asked, because the cause was just. They fought beside British and American soldiers, allies in a shared struggle against tyranny. The victories they won were coalition victories. No single nation liberated Europe alone. But memory is not the same as history. History is what happened. Memory is what we choose to tell. And for too long the telling has been incomplete. The Canadians who landed at Juno, who bled in the Scheldt, who liberated Holland, these men deserved more than a footnote. They deserved to be named, not above their allies, not instead of them, alongside them. Recognition is not a competition. It is an act of honesty, an acknowledgement that the story we inherited was shaped by power, by access, by who controlled the cameras and the printing presses. Today the record is clearer. Historians have restored what popular memory neglected. The archives are open. The truth is available to anyone who seeks it. But truth must be spoken aloud to survive. The veterans are nearly gone now. The last witnesses to those beaches, those flooded polders, those frozen Italian streets. What remains is the obligation of those who came after, to remember, to speak, to ensure that the next generation knows whose boots were on the ground when the fate of the world hung in the balance. Canada did not fight for glory, but it earned the right to be remembered. If this story mattered to you, help keep it alive. Subscribe to Canadian Legacy. Share this video with someone who should know it, and let these voices be heard while we still can. Canada didn't fight for fame, but it deserves to be remembered.